Did Sherman crews truly suffer as much as it's portrayed? You've surely seen popular movies like Fury, where Sherman tankers look desperate and completely outgunned by German panzers, even when fighting at point-blank range. Okay, not everything from the movies should be taken too seriously, but then other myths and nicknames about the Sherman, ranging from Tommy Cooker to Ronson Leiter, tell their own story as well. So once and for all, let's do something different to finally end the debate and show you the real picture of the M4 Sherman tank. You'll see some things you didn't know, and by the end of the video, you can decide for yourself whether it was a trusted warhorse or really nothing more than an outgunned oven waiting to roast its crew. Let's begin. The M4 Sherman was meant to be the great successor to the M3 Lee when the US entered World War II. Back in 1940, Army Ordnance wanted something to replace the M3, which had been intended only as a stopgap solution to buy time for the Sherman's proper development. Lacking the technology to mount its 75mm main gun in a fully rotating turret at the time, the Lee had its 75 fixed in a casemate with a smaller 37mm gun in a turret stacked on top. Its unique, or I can freely say weird, design was chosen so it could have more firepower than the already outdated 37mm gun, but also so it could be immediately deployed in North Africa to cover the horrific Allied tank losses sustained in fighting Rommel's panzers. By the end of August that year, engineers had the blueprint for a new medium tank, and just over a year later, the first prototype rolled out. It kept the Lee's reliable drivetrain and suspension, but now, with a medium-velocity 75mm gun in a rotating turret, like a normal tank should be, it was deemed good enough in all aspects for the time and went straight into mass production. While the Germans were pouring time, manpower, and scarce materials into producing smaller numbers of complex high-quality tanks, like the infamous Tigers, Panthers, and other beasts, the Allies had something different in mind. Just take a look at the numbers. By the time the war ended, America had produced nearly 50,000 Shermans. Meanwhile, Germany had managed just over 1,300 Tiger Ones, 6,000 Panthers, and about 8,000 Panzer IVs, which is a staggering difference. Going back to the Sherman, it arrived in North Africa in 1942 and actually first saw combat in British hands as they desperately needed replacements for their horrific tank losses. The British adored the Sherman's reliability in the desert, something all their other tanks lacked. But already in the first battle, the Sherman's most infamous flaw was recognized, one that would continue to haunt it to this day. And yes, you guessed it correctly, its tendency to explode in a fireball immediately after being hit. Since this is the biggest taboo topic around the Sherman, let's solve it first and then move forward with something you would never hear in documentaries. Yes, at first, this was very true. Early versions of the Sherman had between a 60 and 80% chance of instantly erupting in flames after being hit. Some said it was because of fuel, or because German armor-piercing rounds had explosive filler. But no, it was actually the Sherman's early ammunition stowage, or better said, its lack of proper ammunition stowage. Ammunition was scattered around the tank and stored openly without any protection if something hot and sparky came through the not-so-thick armor. But more important was the location where the majority of shells were kept, and that was in the side sponsons. This is statistically the most likely place to get hit, and shells stored in open, unarmored containers would logically ignite. American crews realized this very quickly after arriving at the front in their brand new tanks. However, after disturbingly many crews were burned, this was finally solved with the introduction of wet stowage. Ammunition racks were now surrounded by a special armored jacket, filled with a water glycol mixture. Upon penetration, this fluid acted as an immediate fire suppressor and bought a few life-saving seconds for the crew to bail out before fire broke out. But more importantly, the rack was relocated from the sponsons to the hull floor, which was much less likely to get hit. The chance of a Sherman bursting into flames after the first hit immediately dropped to just 10 to 15%, and a crewman's survival odds skyrocketed. In newer versions with wider hatches, and when the loader finally got a hatch of his own, the Sherman actually became one of the tanks with the fewest crewmen killed per knockout. On average, only 1.3 crewmen were killed per destroyed tank. For comparison, the Soviet T-34 lost around 2 crewmen per destroyed tank, and they initially had 1 fewer crewmen than the Sherman. I mentioned the loader's hatch, and I want to go back to that to tell you about one perhaps disturbing early flaw of the Sherman. The loader didn't have his own hatch at first, and his way of going in and out of the tank was through the commander's hatch, then under or behind the gun's breech to his position. After him would enter the gunner and the commander. But then, when the tank was hit, he had to get out the same way through the smoke and fire, while some of the crew might be blocking the way. This happened to a Sherman veteran when his tank was hit in the turret and a round went through the gunner and commander, killing them instantly. Smoke was filling the tank, and the loader was desperately trying to move the two bodies out of the way. He then saw light coming from the open assistant driver's hatch, and he went under the gun and through that hatch, escaping in time. If the turret had been rotated the other way, he would have been trapped in a burning tank. Luckily, in later versions, the loader finally had his own hatch, slightly easing his agony. With that being solved, let's move on to another thing often criticized on the Sherman, and that's its firepower, or as people like to say, the lack of it. The main armament was a 75mm M3 gun, backed by two 30 caliber machine guns, one hull mounted and one coaxial, and a 50 caliber on the roof. The 75 fired medium velocity shells, and its barrel was intentionally shorter so it wouldn't extend over the front of the hull. This made transport overseas on ships easier. Although it didn't have sufficient velocity to deal with heavily armored opponents on the battlefield, this gun was quite effective for infantry support, which was what it was designed for in the first place. Okay, it would most likely bounce off the front armor of a Tiger, and even a Panzer IV at any range where their guns would destroy the Sherman. But take a look at this. The 75 actually had very good high explosive shells. And more importantly, in the so-called mad minute, which was the maximum sustained fire for a brief, frantic period, the Sherman could spit out 20 rounds. And remember, Shermans always came in twos, fours, or dozens. So imagine 5 Shermans firing at 2 or 3 German tanks. They'd be putting out a tremendous volume of fire. And even though they might not have been going through armor, they were making significant damage to optics or tracks, jamming the turret, or taking out enemy crew. Many German tanks had to be abandoned by their crews after being crippled by Sherman fire, not necessarily destroyed with one hit from 1,000 meters like the Tiger could manage with its 88, but a win is a win. Also, you have to know that tank-on-tank engagements were quite rare, and when they did happen, they were highly publicized, making it seem like there were far more of them than there actually were. Later in the war, this issue was somewhat solved with the high-velocity 76mm cannon, which traded a bit of explosive effectiveness for far better penetration. Going now to protection. The Sherman's frontal armor was sloped, but it was still thin enough that crews knew it wasn't going to stop high-velocity rounds from German guns. It provided solid protection against everyday battlefield dangers like shrapnel and explosions, but the photos of Shermans covered with logs, sandbags, and other desperate attempts by their crews to add protection really show how those poor guys felt. Improvised armor did help somewhat against Panzerfausts, but there was nothing they could do against high-velocity guns. They knew their armor wasn't going to save their lives, so they had to rely on mobility, tactics, and coordination with other branches of the army for protection. The greatest threat to a Sherman actually came from mines, well-hidden anti-tank guns, and Panzerfausts, not from other tanks. This made any tank riding through a town or unscouted areas without proper infantry support a sitting duck for such attacks. Side and rear armor were even thinner and could even be penetrated by anti-tank rifles at close ranges. So this one we have to agree on. The Sherman wasn't the safest place to be during a battle. Crewmen's fears during battles were often explained as exaggeration, which was understandable. In the heat of battle, Allied tankers, especially less experienced ones, saw every German tank as a dreaded Tiger, especially since the Panzer IV, from a distance, had a similar appearance. German tanks realistically had a much higher psychological impact than their actual numbers and effectiveness. Sure, they were a deadly threat to any tank at the time, especially when lying in ambush for advancing Allied tanks on narrow roads. But there were simply too few of them, and by the second stage of the war, German tank divisions suffered tremendously from fuel and ammo shortages, while air attacks made every open movement dangerous for them. British General Montgomery was concerned about morale, so he publicly said that they had absolutely nothing to fear from Panther or Tiger tanks, and with great tactics they could defeat the Germans without difficulty. His goal was to dispel the myth and prove that the Sherman was not a helpless prey in direct tank combat. But try telling that to a 19-year-old kid ordered to drive down a narrow road toward a German position hidden in the bushes. Battlefield data showed that in many cases Allied armor units were destroying far more German tanks than they lost themselves. This could be seen in General Patton's Third Army, with its 3-to-1 kill ratio against German tanks. Not all Shermans knocked out in combat were permanent losses either. Damaged tanks were often recovered, repaired, and put back in action within days, which was something German crews could only dream of. Okay, sometimes while repairing a tank recovered from battle, what was once an unfortunate tanker had to be washed out with a hose or the interior painted over. But this was part of the war and its horrors that you simply couldn't avoid. You know those wonder masterpiece tanks Hitler adored, like the Tiger II and the super heavy tank destroyers Jagdtiger and Jagdpanther? Well, did you know that more of them were destroyed by their own crews than by the enemy? After breaking down or running out of fuel, German crews often had to abandon their vehicles and blow them up so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands, and that was the end of their superior tanks if they couldn't actually be used. The Sherman, on the other hand, was there when needed, working and in numbers, which, as we can see from today's standpoint, is what mattered more than sheer guns and armor. Upgrades were constantly ongoing, and the Sherman was a far different tank from what had entered the war just a couple of short years earlier. More important, though, were the tactical innovations in Allied tank strategy. Combined arms and smart maneuver in coordination with air support and infantry, rather than reckless open charges, were emphasized. Sherman platoons would report the enemy's position and call in air or artillery support if they feared advancing over open ground at suspected positions of enemy tanks or guns. Then, we come to some other combat advantages of the Sherman you've probably never heard mentioned in those lame documentaries spreading myths. For example, the Sherman could make a full turret rotation in about 17 seconds. For comparison, the Panzer IV needed 26, while heavier tanks like the Panther and Tiger needed over a minute. The Sherman also had an early form of vertical gyro stabilizer that gave it the ability to fire on the move at low speed, with some degree of accuracy, without the need to come to a full stop. This also saved critical seconds for the gunner to take aim. In close fights, this often meant the Sherman crew could fire the first shot, and usually that was what decided the battle. After World War II, you can also see the difference between the Sherman and the so-called superior German tanks. The French army used captured German Panthers, but they kept breaking down and were simply impossible to keep in working order, so they were quickly retired. The Shermans, on the other hand, stayed in French service much longer. They were easy to upgrade and keep somewhat relevant even when new technology came, and the very last frontline Sherman units were phased out in 2003, which is nearly 60 years of service. The Israelis even created their M50 Super Shermans, mounting a French 75mm high-velocity gun, which was a direct copy of the feared Panther's 75, and also adding a new engine and modernized communications. This tank went toe-to-toe with Arab T-54s in the Six-Day War in 1967, showing that it could still remain relevant, even so long after the war it was originally designed for. If you liked this video, maybe check out this one as well. I'll catch you in the next one.